Grid Road, 11 miles west of Birch Coulee, Saskatchewan, January 1956, a few minutes past 8 in the morning. Corporal Walter Bryce, RCMP, 10 years at this posting, eased off the throttle of the 1956 Ford Custom Line before the drift across the road became visible through the windshield. He had felt it in the way the wheel pulled, in the faint hiss of snow crossing pavement that hadn't started crossing the shoulder yet. He knew this stretch. He knew that a wind out of the northwest, holding for more than 3 hours, packed the cut here before it packed anywhere else on the route, and that the packing told him something about what the rest of the 11 miles to the Halverson place would look like before he had driven a quarter of it. Bryce was alone. He had been alone on this detachment since 1946, the only RCMP officer for roughly 400 square miles of mixed grain and grazing land, 2 villages, 1 Hutterite colony, and a scatter of farm families who knew him by name long before they had any particular reason to call him. The detachment had a telephone. The patrol car did not have a radio. The temperature that morning was 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, the kind of cold where an engine left off for more than an hour without a block heater might not start again, and where a man walking the wrong direction for 40 minutes could die of exposure within sight of a road. Whatever Bryce knew when he left the detachment that morning was, for the next several hours, the only operational resource available on that road. The call had come in the night before, relayed through the Halversons' party line by a neighbor 2 farms over. Trouble at the place. Nothing more specific than that. Bryce had asked 2 questions before he hung up, and from the answers, he already had a working idea of what he would find that a dispatcher's note, if Saskatchewan rural policing in 1956 had run on dispatcher's notes, could never have contained. What were those 2 questions? And what had 10 years at one detachment given Corporal Bryce that no provincial police circular, no RCMP Gazette bulletin, and no centralized record had ever been built to hold? The car Bryce was driving was a 1956 Ford Custom Line, the higher specification Ford model the RCMP used for prairie patrol work rather than the base mainline sold south of the border. 2-tone black body, white front doors. By 1956, the doors carried a single RCMP crest decal rather than the stenciled black lettering the force had used through the early part of the decade, a change made the previous year across the divisions. The car had a heater, a speedometer, and a single rotating dome light. It did not have a 2-way radio. 2-way radio existed in 1956. Utility companies and trucking fleets in Western Canada were already using mobile units for dispatch, but it had not yet reached single-officer prairie detachments like Birch Coulee. What the detachment had instead was a telephone, twice-daily police bulletins broadcast over Cape Regina since 1938, reporting stolen vehicles and missing persons, and Bryce. The institution could tell him, before he left, what had been stolen and who was missing across the division. It could not tell him which cut on the grid road 11 miles out packed first in a northwest wind, or what trouble at the place was likely to mean at the Halverson farm in January. That information existed nowhere except in the man driving the car. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian patrol between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the posting, the territory knowledge that years in one place built in the officer who drove the same roads in 4 seasons, and the communities those officers served, in the full complexity of what that service meant in this era. Not mountie mythology, the documented operational and human reality of patrol in a country whose geography required its officers to know their territory the way no centralized system has ever been asked to know it. What did 10 years at one Saskatchewan detachment give Corporal Bryce about the grid roads west of Birch Coulee that no RCMP Gazette circular and no centralized dispatch was ever built to hold? And if you served in the RCMP or a provincial police force in this era, or your family did, put it in the comments. If you or someone in your family served at a single-officer detachment on the prairies, what is one piece of local knowledge they carried that never made it into any file? Next time, the RCMP dog sled patrols of the Northwest Territories, and the territory knowledge that arrived only after a man was lost trying to learn it the hard way. The first question Bryce had asked the neighbor relaying the call was whether anyone at the Halverson place had been drinking. The second was whether it was Eric or his older brother Canute handling the cattle that week. Neither question would have meant anything to a dispatcher reading a file. To Bryce, the answers mattered because of what he had learned about the Halverson family across 9 previous calls to that farm since 1947. That trouble there in winter tended to follow a specific pattern involving one brother and not the other, and that the difference between Eric home and Eric away changed what trouble at the place was likely to mean by a wide margin. The dispatcher's note, if Saskatchewan rural policing in 1956 had run on dispatcher's notes, would have said only, disturbance reported, Halverson Farm, Section 22. This is what a long single-officer posting produced, and it was not something the RCMP trained for directly. The force assigned a corporal to a prairie detachment and left him there. In Bryce's case, 10 years. In many comparable Saskatchewan and Manitoba postings of this period documented in RCMP Gazette retrospectives, anywhere from 5 to 15. What accumulated in that time was not formal knowledge. It was the kind of knowledge that came from being wrong once. Bryce had misjudged the cut on the grid road in February 1948, in his second winter at the posting, and gone into the ditch 4 miles short of a call that turned out, that time, not to be urgent. And from the accumulated weight of every subsequent call building on what the last one had taught him. By 1956, the Birch Coulee detachment territory was not a map Bryce consulted. It was a body of specific, accumulated, person by person and road section by road section knowledge that existed only because one man had stayed in one place long enough to acquire it. What did the rest of that body of knowledge cover, and how far did it extend beyond roads and weather, into the families themselves? It extended into nearly every household across 400 square miles, with varying depth. Bryce knew which farms had a working telephone, and which depended on a neighbor's line. He knew which families had men who worked the elevator at harvest and slept through the day in winter, so that a call to that household before noon meant something different than the same call at 4 in the afternoon. He knew the Hutterite colony's internal structure well enough to know which elder to approach first, on a matter involving the colony. A piece of knowledge that mattered, because going to the wrong person first could close off cooperation that would otherwise have been immediate. None of this was written anywhere. RCMP Gazette retrospectives on comparable single-officer prairie postings in this period describe this kind of accumulated local knowledge as the de facto operating manual of rural policing in the era before centralized dispatch, present in the officer, absent from the institution's records, and gone the moment the officer left the post. The seasonal pattern mattered as much as the family pattern. A call to an isolated farm in January carried a different likely cause than the identical call in July. Cabin pressure, a bad month, a family that had been managing something difficult since November, and had finally reached a point where a neighbor felt obliged to use the party line. Bryce had learned to read winter calls differently than summer ones, not because anyone had told him to, but because 9 winters of calls to the same roughly 40 households had shown him the pattern without ever stating it as a rule. What did the dispatch and record-keeping systems available to the RCMP in 1956 actually capture of all of this? And what happened to it the day an officer like Bryce transferred or retired? What the record-keeping captured was almost nothing. Saskatchewan RCMP divisional files from this period and comparable provincial police records elsewhere on the prairies logged calls, outcomes, and statistics, not the texture of why an officer made the judgment he made on the way to a call. When Bryce eventually transferred, retired, or died, the specific knowledge of who was who at the Halverson farm, which cut packed first in a northwest wind, and what a January call from a particular party line was statistically likely to mean, would leave with him. There was no formal mechanism in 1956 RCMP rural policing for transferring this knowledge to a successor beyond a handover period of a few days or weeks, during which a new officer absorbed what he could before the previous officer's accumulated decade was simply gone. Comparable RCMP divisional retrospectives describe new officers in this period needing 2 to 3 full years before their own judgment on a posting's roads and families began to approach what the previous officer had carried out the door. This was the operational reality underneath the patrol car and the Red Surge, an institution that, in single-officer prairie detachments, ran substantially on knowledge it had never formally captured, recorded, or recognized as an institutional asset. Knowledge that existed because one corporal had been left in one place long enough to build it, and that the dispatch desk in Regina, however well it tracked stolen cars and wanted persons, simply did not have. But the knowledge that mattered to Bryce was not only about roads, weather, and family histories. It was about what the community itself understood its relationship with him to be. And that relationship looked different, depending on which part of the 400 square miles you asked. For the grain and grazing families on Bryce's patrol route, the relationship was largely social before it was institutional. He attended the same community hall dances the families attended. He knew which farm's well had gone bad 2 summers running, and which family was quietly struggling with a bad debt at the implement dealer in town. Information that had nothing to do with policing, and everything to do with the fact that he was, functionally, one of the few people in the territory whose job required him to visit every household periodically, regardless of whether anything was wrong. For the 2 villages on the route, the relationship was more visible still. Bryce was a known face at the grain elevator, the general store, and the rink in winter, recognized on sight by people who had never had occasion to call the detachment for anything. This closeness produced real value. Disputes that might otherwise have escalated into formal complaints were sometimes resolved with a conversation, because both parties knew Bryce and trusted that he knew the situation's history. RCMP divisional histories of comparable single-officer prairie detachments in this period describe this informal mediating function as a documented, if unofficial, part of what these postings actually did. The corporal, as the only person in the territory, both parties to a dispute were likely to know personally and trust roughly equally. None of this made Bryce a more important figure than the people he served. It made him a familiar one, and in a territory this size, familiarity was itself a kind of operational infrastructure. It also produced real complication. Policing people you had known personally for a decade meant that enforcement was never purely procedural, and the same closeness that built trust could also mean an officer hesitated, or didn't, in ways that a stranger in the same uniform might not have. The honest accounting of what this relationship was cannot stop at the farm families and the 2 villages. Bryce's patrol territory, like most RCMP prairie divisions in this period, bordered land where the same institution he represented had a different and more troubled history. The RCMP's own 2011 internal review of its role in the Indian residential school system, a 173-page report prepared by RCMP historian Marcel Eugene Leboeuf and presented to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, documents that across more than a century, RCMP officers served as the primary enforcement mechanism for mandatory residential school attendance under the Indian Act, locating children who had run from the schools and returning them, transporting children from their homes when Indian agents required it, and functioning, in the report's own description, largely as truant officers for a system administered jointly by the federal government and the churches that ran the schools. This was not a separate institution from the one Bryce served in. It was the same RCMP, the same decade, the same chain of command, a force whose officers in some postings spent meaningful parts of their working hours enforcing the residential school system, and whose officers in other postings, like Bryce's, spent their working hours on grid roads and party line calls to farm families. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 2015 final report, and the RCMP's own research underlying it, documents that this enforcement role produced a lasting distrust between Indigenous communities and the RCMP that the institution itself has since publicly acknowledged, including a formal 2004 apology from the Commissioner and further acknowledgement from his successor in 2014. Both of these things were true about the RCMP of the 1950s in the same years, and the same general region, the territory knowledge that made Bryce useful to the families on his route, and the institutional role that made the same uniform a source of fear and forced separation for Indigenous families elsewhere in the division. Neither one cancels the other. Both are the institutional context within which a corporal's 10 years of local knowledge existed. What happened to detachments like Birch Coulee did not happen all at once. And it did not happen because anyone decided that the kind of knowledge Bryce carried was without value. It happened because the RCMP, like provincial police forces across the prairies, moved through the 1960s and 1970s toward a different operating model. Larger districts, shorter postings, two-way radio in every car, and eventually centralized dispatch and digital records that gave headquarters visibility into where every unit was at any moment. The RCMP nationally still operated genuine single-officer detachments in remote communities into the 2000s. The practice was common enough that the force only moved formally in 2012 to require a minimum of 3 officers per detachment, citing officer safety. But across the settled prairie grain belt, the consolidation came earlier, through the 1960s and into the early 1970s. As rural population declined, road networks improved, and the institution judged that a district patrol car covering several former single-officer territories was a more efficient use of resources than an officer posted to one for a decade. What consolidation gave the RCMP was real: flexible deployment, lower fixed costs per detachment, faster response on improved roads, and a communications system that meant no officer ever again left contact range the way Bryce did on the morning he drove out to the Halverson place with a telephone behind him and nothing ahead. RCMP Gazette retrospectives on prairie detachment consolidation describe this period candidly as a trade of depth for coverage, a trade the institution judged necessary, and one it has never fully reversed. What it did not give back was the specific thing that 10 years at Birch Coulee had built in one man, and there was no line item in the consolidation plan for what that specific thing had been worth. By the time the Birch Coulee detachment was folded into a 3-territory district operation based in a larger town nearby, Bryce had already retired. The officer who inherited the district's coverage of the old Birch Coulee roads had a 2-way radio, a faster car, and a paper file listing the territory's farms by legal section number. He did not have 9 winters of being wrong once and right afterward. He knew the grid road from the map. He did not know it from the wheel pulling slightly before the drift became visible. If this channel is going to keep documenting what Canadian patrol officers knew about their territories and what it cost the institution when that knowledge left, subscribe. There are more grid roads, more northern detachments, more dog sled crossings, more family calls carrying context that the file never recorded, and none of it was ever asked to write itself down. What did 10 years at 1 Saskatchewan detachment give Corporal Bryce about the grid roads west of Birch Coulee that no RCMP Gazette circular and no centralized dispatch was ever built to hold? And if you have a patrol route, a posting, a winter road, or a detachment in your own family's history, put it in the comments. What is one piece of local knowledge an officer in your family carried that never made it into any file? Next time, the RCMP dog sled patrols of the Northwest Territories, and the territory knowledge that arrived only after a man was lost, trying to learn it the hard way. Corporal Walter Bryce retired from the RCMP in 1962, 16 years after he arrived at Birch Coulee. The detachment was consolidated into a 3-territory district operation in 1971. What consolidation gave the RCMP? Flexible deployment, a faster car, a radio that reached every point on the route. What it did not give the grid road west of Birch Coulee, an officer who knew which cut packed first in a northwest wind. The district patrol car that answered a call out that way in 1972 knew the route from the file. It got there. It did not know what 9 winters and 1 bad ditch in 1948 had taught the man before him. Bryce had known it. Nobody had asked what it was before he went home for the last time.